Hey, come on in, settle in wherever you're listening from, the car, the kitchen, a walk you're taking, just to get 5 quiet minutes to yourself. I'm glad you're here. This is Self-Love Wednesday, and today we're going to sit with something most people never stop to examine because it happens too fast to catch. I want to start with a question, and I want you to actually sit with it instead of rushing past it. What does your voice sound like when you're hurt? Not what does it sound like when you're calm, explaining yourself well after you've had time to think. What does it actually sound like in the moment, before you've had a chance to edit yourself? Most of us have never really listened to ourselves. We know what we meant to say. We rarely know what we sounded like saying it. Here's the truth. Tone sets off more fights than words ever will. You can say something completely reasonable, something fair, something even kind on paper, and still watch the other person's face change before you finish the sentence. That's not them being oversensitive. That's them responding to something real. They're hearing history, not information. Let me slow down and actually explain what I mean by that, because this is the idea the whole episode is built on. Words carry information. They tell the other person what happened, what you need, what's true. But tone carries something else entirely. Tone carries the emotional temperature you walked into the room with. It carries every unresolved moment that came before this one. It carries whatever you learned a long time ago about what it takes to be heard, to be safe, to be taken seriously. So when your tone comes out sharp or clipped or cold, that's not random. That's a decision your nervous system made in a fraction of a second based on something you learned how to do a long time before this relationship ever started. I want you to really sit with that, because it changes everything about how you understand your own reactions. Your tone isn't a character flaw. It's not proof that you're a difficult person or an angry person or someone who just can't communicate. Your tone is a decision, an old one, running on autopilot. And anything that was learned can be relearned. This is where self-love actually does its work, not the version of self-love that's about bubble baths and treating yourself. The version that's about looking honestly at your own patterns without collapsing into shame over them. So let's talk about where this tone actually comes from, because understanding the source is what makes it possible to change. Think about the environment you grew up in, or the relationships that shaped you before this one. Somewhere in there, you learned a strategy. Maybe getting sharp and clipped was the only way to be heard in a house that talked over you. Maybe going cold and quiet was the only way to stay safe when things got loud. Maybe you learned that if you didn't defend yourself immediately, you'd be steamrolled. None of that was wrong of you to learn. It kept you functional in an environment that needed it. The problem isn't that you learned it. The problem is that you're still running the same program in a relationship that doesn't require it anymore. Here's a question worth asking yourself honestly. When was the last time your tone came out sharper than the situation actually called for? Not because your partner did something unreasonable, but because something in you got triggered before your mind even caught up. Chances are you can think of one right now. That's not evidence you're broken. That's evidence you're human, running an old program that's overdue for an update. So what do we actually do with this? Let's get practical, because awareness without a practice just turns into another thing to feel bad about. The first practice is what I call the pause before the sentence. This is simple, but it is not easy. The moment you feel your body respond before your words do, the jaw tightening, the chest getting hot, the breath getting shallow, that is the signal. Not a signal to suppress what you're feeling, a signal to pause for one breath before you speak it. One breath. That's it. That one breath is often the entire distance between the tone that escalates the room and the tone that actually gets you heard. The second practice is naming it out loud in the moment instead of hiding it. Something as simple as, I'm noticing I want to snap right now, and that's not about you, that's old. That sentence does something remarkable. It takes the tone out of the driver's seat and puts your awareness back in charge. Your partner isn't a mind reader. But when you narrate what's happening in you instead of just letting the old tone run the show, you give them something to respond to besides the sharpness itself. The third practice, and this one takes the most courage, is going back after the fact when you notice your tone ran the conversation instead of you. Not to grovel, not to over apologize, just to say something honest. The tone I used earlier wasn't really about the dishes. I want to understand where that came from. That single sentence does more for a relationship than almost anything else I teach because it separates the person from the pattern. You are not your tone. You are the person capable of noticing it and choosing differently next time. I want to be honest with you about something else because this deserves to be said plainly. This work is not about becoming a different person. It's not about suppressing everything you feel so you can perform calm. That's not intimacy, that's a mask. The goal isn't to never feel triggered again. The goal is to shrink the gap between the trigger and your awareness of it until eventually that pause becomes automatic instead of something you have to force. Let's go a little deeper on that third practice because it's the one people resist the most, and I want to tell you why it matters so much. Going back after the fact feels risky. It feels like reopening something that's already settled or handing your partner ammunition or admitting weakness. I understand that instinct completely. But here's what actually happens when you do it. When you go back and say, the tone I used earlier wasn't really about the dishes. You're not weakening your position. You're doing the opposite. You're showing your partner that you're capable of self-reflection instead of self-defense. Over time, that becomes one of the most trusted things about you in the relationship. Not that you never get sharp, but that you're willing to look at it honestly afterward. I also want to talk about something that trips a lot of people up here, which is the difference between explaining and excusing. When you tell your partner, that tone came from somewhere old, you might worry, it sounds like you're making an excuse for how you treated them. It's not the same thing, and the distinction matters. An excuse says, so it's not really my fault. An explanation says, here's what's happening in me, and I still own the impact it had on you. You can hold both of those at once. In fact, real intimacy requires you to hold both of those at once, understanding where the pattern comes from and taking responsibility for what it does to the people you love. Now let's talk about how you actually start noticing this in real time, because awareness is a skill, and like any skill, it gets built through repetition, not through one moment of insight. Start small. You don't need to catch every sharp moment this week. Start by noticing just one thing, the physical sensation that shows up right before your tone shifts. For some people, it's heat in the chest. For some, it's the jaw locking. For some, it's a kind of tunnel vision where the only thing that matters is getting your point across. Whatever yours is, that sensation is data. It's telling you something is about to run on autopilot. The first few times, you might not catch it until afterward. That's completely normal. Awareness always starts in hindsight before it moves into the moment itself. Over time, something shifts. You start noticing it in the moment instead of after. And eventually, this is the part worth waiting for. You start noticing it before it even fully arrives. That one breath I mentioned earlier stops being something you have to force yourself to remember. It becomes the new default. That's not a small thing. That's the actual work of growth happening in real time inside your own nervous system. I want to be honest with you about the timeline here too, because I don't want to oversell this. This isn't a one episode fix. Tone patterns that took years to build don't dissolve in a week. But every single time you catch that gap between what you feel and what you say, you are laying down a new pathway. You're proving to yourself one moment at a time that the old program isn't the only option anymore. This is exactly the kind of tool we built out fully inside the Conversation Reset Toolkit. Practical real-time practices for catching your own tone before it runs the conversation for you. In language you can actually use in the moment instead of scrambling for the right words after the damage is already done. If today's episode is resonating with you, that toolkit is linked right below this episode and it's $27. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with this. Your tone was built to protect a younger version of you who needed it. That version of you did nothing wrong, but you are not that person anymore. And the relationship you're in right now doesn't require the same defenses the old one did. Every time you catch that gap between what you feel and what you say, you are doing the work. Not perfectly, just honestly. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I know your time is valuable, and the fact that you chose to spend part of it here doing this kind of work on yourself says something about who you are. I'll see you Sunday when we take this same idea and bring it into the relationship itself. And most important, remember, you are extraordinary.